He never told anyone his real name, not his deputies, not the woman he stole from his business partner and brought to Albuquerque like she was a piece of furniture he had decided to keep, not the sheriff who called him friend and fought for him until the very end, not the 1,500 people who watched him die. He carried his true name to the gallows and left it there, in the cold February air of 1883. Alongside everything else Albuquerque had decided it was finished with. What they hanged that morning was a man called Milton Yarberry. What they buried in Santa Barbara Cemetery, with the noose still around his neck and his name misspelled on the stone, was a question that has never been fully answered. The physical record of the man begins in violence and does not deviate from that course for a single year of his documented life. Born John Armstrong in Walnut Ridge, Arkansas in 1849, he left home after killing a man in a land dispute, the specific territorial kind of killing that the frontier produced in quantity and the law pursued with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on who the dead man was. He changed his name. He moved. He killed again in Helena, Arkansas in 1873 and moved again, falling in with Dave Rudabaugh and the man history would record as Mysterious Dave Mather, a loose confederation of robbers and drifters working the rough seam between southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, where the law was thin and the distances between consequences were long. When the three were implicated in the murder of a prominent rancher, they rode into Texas and separated. Yarberry surfaced in Texarkana, killed a man he believed to be a bounty hunter, and kept moving. The bounty on his head from the Sharp County murder was $200. Not a fortune, but enough to make a man careful about strangers asking questions. What he did next was either the most audacious decision of his life or the most logical one, depending on how you read the frontier mind. He joined the Texas Rangers, Company B, Frontier Battalion, Jack County, Texas. He served under his assumed name, kept his past behind him, and by the accounts later uncovered by historian Robert Dearment, he served honorably. The Rangers, who were not in the habit of asking deep biographical questions of men willing to ride hard in difficult country, had no reason to look behind the name he gave them. He left in 1876 and drifted, Decatur, Texas, where he opened a saloon, killed the bounty hunter who came asking about him, and left the body outside of town. Dodge City, Cannon City, Colorado, where he opened another saloon and a variety theater, played the violin with enough competence that the performer Eddie Foy mentioned it later in his published memoirs, and took on a business partner named Tony Preston. He would later take Tony Preston's wife. Sadie Preston and her 4-year-old daughter arrived in Albuquerque with Yarberry in late 1879, in a new town that was growing fast along the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad line, and needed, urgently, practically, without excessive scrutiny of the applicant's history, someone to keep order. Bernalillo County Sheriff Perfecto Armijo provided the answer. Armijo was a man of political instinct and personal loyalty, and the loyalty he extended to Yarberry was of the kind that does not bend under pressure and does not recalculate when the numbers change. He supported the appointment. He championed the man. He would, in the end, be the one tasked with killing him, a fact that says something specific and unsparing about the mechanics of frontier justice and the cost of misplaced faith. Yarberry took the marshal's badge in 1880 and proved immediately that he could perform the function. He killed 2 men in arrest situations within a short period of taking office, quickly, efficiently, without apparent hesitation, which was either evidence of professional competence or evidence of a man for whom killing had become the reflexive answer to resistance. On the frontier of 1880, the distinction between those two things was often academic. Harry Brown arrived in Albuquerque sometime around the beginning of 1881 and announced himself in the way that men of his particular type announced themselves, loudly, repeatedly, and in saloons. He was a heavy drinker with a short temper and a habit of drawing his pistol on insufficient provocation. He claimed to have killed men. Nobody could verify the number or confirm the kills. But nobody pushed back hard enough to find out whether the bragging was hollow, because the gun was real and the temper was genuine, and the frontier had taught people to extend a certain working credit to that combination. Brown and Sadie Preston became acquainted. By February 1881, they were something more than acquainted. On the night of March the 27th, 1881, there was a slight chill in the air, the specific dry cold of a New Mexico spring evening that settles into the streets after dark and makes the lamplight from restaurant windows look warmer than it is. Yarberry was walking Sadie's young daughter along the street. He did not know that Sadie was inside Gerard's restaurant with Brown. He did not know about any of it. He was a man carrying a child's hand through the spring dark, headed toward a situation that someone else had already arranged for him. Brown heard Yarberry was coming. He stepped outside and waited. Yarberry arrived. He took the child inside. He came back out. The two men spoke, and the speaking deteriorated in the way the conversations between men carrying loaded weapons and grievances deteriorate, incrementally, then suddenly. They moved to a vacant lot. Brown told Yarberry repeatedly, with the specific verbal aggression of a man working himself towards something, that he was not afraid of him. Sadie appeared in the restaurant doorway and called Brown's name. Yarberry heard her voice and turned. Brown hit him in the face and drew his pistol in the same motion, a practiced combination that suggested this was not improvised. He fired once. The bullet creased Yarberry's hand, close, but mechanical failure of the most human kind, a fraction of an inch of deviation between a crease and a killing shot. Yarberry drew his own pistol and fired twice in quick succession. Both rounds entered Brown's chest. Brown was dead before the sound of the second shot had finished traveling down the street. Sheriff Armijo arrived and took his friend into custody with the visible reluctance of a man performing a duty he finds personally objectionable. The preliminary hearing cleared Yarberry on self-defense. A grand jury convened in May at the insistence of prominent citizens who were not satisfied with the result. Heard a parade of witnesses assembled by Yarberry's attorney S.M. Barnes and acquitted him on May 19, 1881. He had been free for less than a month when he killed again. June 18, 1881. Yarberry was sitting on the front porch of his friend Elwood Maiden's home, talking with a gambler named Monty Frank Boyd, when a shot was heard from the direction of the R.H. Greenleaf restaurant. Both men ran toward the sound. Yarberry asked a bystander who had fired. The bystander pointed at a man walking away down the street. Yarberry called to him to halt. 3 shots were fired. Charles D. Campbell fell dead. What happened in the space between the halt and the shots is the central question of the case that would end Milton Yarberry's life, and it has never been resolved to the satisfaction of everyone who has examined it. Yarberry claimed Campbell turned and drew on him. Campbell had a pistol on his person. The pistol had been fired, but no witness could testify that the gun was in Campbell's hand when Yarberry shot him. One witness, attorney Thomas Parks of Platte City, Nebraska, who happened to be present, stated clearly that he saw no gun in Campbell's hands. One of the bullet wounds was in Campbell's back. Yarberry's explanation for the back wound, that Campbell's body had spun when the front round hit, is mechanically plausible. A heavy pistol round entering the chest cavity at an angle, striking bone, transferring momentum. Bodies do not fall in straight lines. But plausible is not the same as proven, and the frontier was changing around Yarberry in ways he had not accounted for. Albuquerque was no longer a raw railroad camp tolerating rough men, because rough men were what the work required. It was a town with ambitions, commercial ambitions, social ambitions, the specific civic vanity of a place that wants to be taken seriously and finds certain associations inconvenient. A town marshal who had now killed 4 men in Albuquerque alone, whose past was a corridor of bodies stretching back through New Mexico and Texas and Arkansas, was not the image that the prominent citizens wanted associated with their streets. New Mexico's new governor, Lionel Sheldon, understood the moment. The territory was saturated with the names of violent men: Billy the Kid, John Kinney, and Sheldon intended to demonstrate that the machinery of law was functional and final. Yarberry was a useful demonstration. The trial lasted 3 days. The Attorney General of New Mexico prosecuted personally. The jury convicted. The sentence was death by hanging. On September 9, 1882, Yarberry escaped from the Santa Fe jail with 3 other prisoners. A $500 bounty was placed on him immediately. He was recaptured 4 days later, 28 miles outside of town, by a posse led by Santa Fe Police Chief Frank Chavez. His attorney filed appeals all the way to Washington. Everyone was denied. In his final interview, a reporter told Yarberry he looked pale. He replied, "Maybe, but I ain't sick, and I ain't scared either." February 9, 1883. Over 1,500 people gathered at the Albuquerque courthouse, some having paid $1 for a better position. New Mexico militia stood guard by order of the governor. Yarberry asked that Sheriff Bowman of Colfax County pull the lever in place of Armijo to spare his friend the task. Bowman declined. Armijo did not ask to be relieved. He stood where he was supposed to stand and did what he was required to do. The mechanism used that morning was not a standard trapdoor gallows. It was an apparatus that jerked the condemned upward rather than dropping him down, a design that the Las Vegas Optic had described 2 years earlier, in a phrase that entered the vernacular of territorial journalism as being jerked to Jesus. As Yarberry went up, his head struck a crossbeam. Whether he died from the rope or the beam was a question the attending physician declined to answer with certainty. The method was never used again in New Mexico. He was buried in Santa Barbara Cemetery with the noose still around his neck. His tombstone was inscribed with his name misspelled. The stone has since gone missing. Before the lever was pulled, Yarberry looked out at the 1,500 people who had come to watch him die and said what he had been saying since the day they arrested him for Campbell. "Gentlemen, you are hanging an innocent man." Sheriff Armijo, who had appointed him, defended him, fought for him, and was now required by the machinery of the law he served to execute him, never stopped agreeing. The man's true name went with him. Somewhere in Arkansas, a family that Yarberry had described to Elwood Maiden as respectable, a family he had left to protect from the shame of the life he chose, lived out their years without knowing what had become of the son or brother or cousin who had disappeared into the frontier and returned, decades later, only as a name in a newspaper account of a hanging. He had asked Maiden to protect them from that. He had given up his name to protect them from that. The one mercy in a life that contained very little of it. A man who spent 30 years running from his own name finally stopped running in Albuquerque and discovered that the town had already decided what to call him. A problem to be solved, a reputation to be buried, a lesson to be made. They spelled it wrong on the stone. He would have expected nothing less.